So we, because of this world of will, we have a world of suffering. The will seeks its own well-being at the expense of others, and he says constantly sinks its teeth into its own flesh. This is expressed in the well-known phrase, man is wolf to man, homo homini lupus. Every human is tossed to and fro between pain and satiety. The pain is real, a positive thing, but pleasure is really the absence of pain, a negative. It passes over into boredom. So the question is, are there life satisfactions? Yes, but compared with the pain of our desires and our disappointments, they are short and scant. He continues, almost without exception, previous philosophers have placed the essence of mind in intellect and consciousness, but this is the mere crust of our minds. Underneath is the will. Nature produced the intellect for the service of the will. Therefore, it's only designed to know what is beneficial for the will, not to comprehend reality. Will is the only permanent and unchanging element in the mind. So in a nutshell, to see that the individual is only the appearance, the phenomenon, not the thing in itself. To see underneath the constant change of matter, there is the fixed permanence of form. This is the essence of philosophy. His life work was to demonstrate that life was not worth living. In his defense, if he needs one from you, he was born in 1812 and lived during the time when pessimism was very common, because it was the time of the Napoleonic Wars, where Europe was devastated, and also it was the time of the 1848 wars. In his personal life, contrary to what you might think, he had a pretty good one. He was born into a family of means from financial explorations. His father made a lot of money and wanted him to go into the business. Schopenhauer didn't want to. He felt this compelling idea early in his life. So he went off on his own. He tried to have an academic career, and he foolishly, egoistically had his presentations, his tutoring at the same time as the great Hegel did. And so he had about 4 people in his class who quickly dropped out, and Hegel had hundreds of people because he was the man of the time. And he was not a pessimist. Hegel taught that things are going to get better and better. So he retired to a small community outside the city, and he spent his time in 2 rented rooms with a dog, and this tells you something. This will tell you something about him that shows something about the man himself. At the beginning of each meal, he would put a gold coin on the table before him. At the end of his meal, he would remove it. When finally someone asked him why he acted so strangely, he said it was because it was his silent wager to drop the coin into the poor box outside on the first day that the English officers dining there would talk of anything other than horses, women, or dogs. His thinking tremendously influenced subsequent philosophers, thinkers, and even musicians. Wagner was extremely enamored of his theory, and his Tristan and Isolde was influenced by Schopenhauer. This idea of in Tristan, there's this willing, and then suddenly this climax. And so that was really the will there. Tolstoy called him the genius among men. His pupil Nietzsche followed his example by declaring God was dead. Schopenhauer had preceded him. He was the first Western philosopher to declare himself an atheist. No one had dared to do so before. And Nietzsche admitted that Schopenhauer was his great teacher. Is that Eileen?
This is for the airplane.
Oh.
We're closing the window.
Dostoevsky, Kafka, Thomas Mann were influenced. And in the 20th century, Wittgenstein brought him back from virtual death with his influence. Wittgenstein, you can clearly see in his writings the influence of Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is a series of firsts. He was the first Western philosopher to acknowledge the value for life of Buddhism and Hinduism. And until Jung, he was the only major Western philosopher to draw parallels between Eastern and Western thought. He independently came to the conclusion that the world is a unity. It started with Kant. Kant, most of his work, almost his entire work, was devoted to the idea of what we can know, metaphysics. And Kant said, we cannot know anything beyond our limited viewpoint, which is the world of causality, time, and space. And so if you go through Kant's work, you can see that you will be led to the conclusion that the world itself is a unity, and this plethora of things that we see is generated by our minds. All is one. When he wrote this, he hadn't yet encountered the Eastern philosophers. So he was gratified to find out later that he was in sync with them. His ethics were simple. The essential moral quality of human beings should be compassion for others. In truth, he believed we individuals are only parts of one single organism, humanity. So compassion simply makes sense. The man was such a large thinker, he even anticipated physics. He said, since the world of everyday common sense consists of matter in motion, the ultimate entity in all this dynamism of matter is energy. He said that energy is the ultimate thing in itself. It's reality. In human beings, this energy manifests as the will, but in dead matter, it manifests as bottled energy, and all matter is transmutable to energy. And this doctrine was declared to be the case by physicists 100 years later, and he had simply reasoned it out. I am left with, we'll go into the sayings anon. After going through his books, I went through them twice before and went trip, partly this time. It still, there's a lot of questions, but the main question that nobody can answer is why do we suffer? And does the will provide a sufficient answer for us? So let's see. I'll hand out. Let's give you first. Let's see. I'll give you second because it's long. No. His second because it's longer.
Oh, okay.
Let's see. I'll give you the shorter ones if you want. Okay. So this is a long one. You want a long one? Okay. So this is long. Okay. This is short, and this is short. You want it?
No.
So I'll just start with this trenchant saying of his. The more intense the will, the more glaring the phenomenon of its conflict, and hence the greater the suffering. A will composed of phenomena of a more intense will to life than the present one would exhibit so much greater suffering, it would be hell. As it is, he wonders why people don't commit suicide, but says there's no point in committing suicide because the will is going to take a manifestation, and your manifestation doesn't matter. But I think if you suicide, you do get rid of your own manifestation, which is important when you suicide. Okay, sayings one.
Does existence have meaning? No. That's bold and underlined.
That's me.
We need to face the truth that human nature is faced with unresolved desire, suffering, and boredom. Life is pointless. It is a business that doesn't cover its costs. It is preferable not to exist at all. Should I just read through all of them? Okay, so.
I can stop you if you get tired or I get tired. Just keep going.
Okay. If we attain our desire, it is only a momentary satisfaction. Willing is mostly endless, and too much satisfaction leads only to boredom. The intellect may seem at times to lead the will, but only as a guide leads his master. The will is the strong blind man who carries on his shoulders the lame man who can see. We do not want a thing because we have found reasons for it. We find reasons for it because we want it. Let me read that again. We do not want a thing because we have found reasons for it. And we find reasons for it because we want it. We even elaborate philosophies and theologies to cloak our desires. The understanding of the stupidest man becomes keen when objects are in question that closely concern his interests. The intellect is always subordinate to desire. Men are only apparently drawn from in front. In reality, they are pushed from behind. They think they are led on by what they see, when in truth they are driven on by what they feel, by instincts of whose operation they are largely unconscious. Intellect is merely the minister of foreign affairs.
So I'll do this next one and we'll lead into your next one.
Number two.
You have number two?
I have number two.
Okay. So character lies in the will. A good will or heart is profounder and more reliable than a clear mind. Brilliant qualities of mind win admiration, but never affection. All religions promise a reward for excellences of the heart or the will, but none for excellences of the head or understanding. What if will is the long sought for thing in itself, the ultimate inner reality and essence of all things? It is. John?
The eternal enemy of all creatures is death. The will to reproduce aspires to defeat death by the strategy and martyrdom of reproduction. At maturity, every organism hastens to sacrifice itself to the task of reproduction. From the spider who is eaten up by the female he had just fertilized, or the wasp that devotes itself to gathering food for offspring it will never see, to the man who wears himself to ruin in the effort to feed and educate his children. Only by this blind instinct can the will conquer death, and to ensure conquest of death, the will to reproduce is placed beyond control of knowledge or reflection. Even a philosopher occasionally has children. Eros is the principle from which all things proceed. The law of sexual attraction is that the choice of a mate is largely determined by the mutual fitness to procreate. Make the critical attention with which we scrutinize a woman who begins to please us. Clearly, the individual is acting out the will. Youth without beauty still has attraction. Beauty without youth has none. The essential matter is not reciprocation of love, but possession and reproduction. Since love is the deception practiced by nature, marriage is the attrition of love and must be disillusioning. Only the philosopher can be happy in marriage, and philosophers do not marry.
Okay.
So how many kids did he have?
None.
He's very good.
He did not marry. This is number 3. I'll just give the first one. You're number 3? Oh, you're not, sorry. Okay, only in space and time do we seem to be separate beings. Space and time are the veil of Maya, an illusion hiding the unity of things. In reality, there are only the species, only life, only the will.
The true symbol of nature is the circle because it is the schema of reoccurrence. Force is a form of will. The force which draws the lovers and the force that draws the planet are one. The notion of human progress is mere conceit and folly. In general, the wise of all ages say the same things, and the fools who at all times form the immense majority say the opposite. Each species, each organism is irrevocably determined by the whole. Everyone believes himself to be perfectly free, even in his individual actions, and thinks that at every moment he can commence another manner of life, that is, to become another person. In spite of this, he finds himself playing the part which he himself condemns. The world is evil. If the world is will, it must be a world of suffering. This is because desire is infinite and the fulfillment is limited. It is like the alms thrown to a beggar that keeps him alive today, in order that his misery may be prolonged tomorrow. As long as we are subject to willing, we can never have lasting peace. Nothing is so fatal to an ideal as its realization. The will must live on itself, for there is nothing behind it, and it is a hungry will.
And it is a hungry will. Are you next?
I appear to be next. Life is evil because as soon as desire is well satisfied, then boredom ensues. Even if the socialist utopia were obtained, innumerable evils would be left because some of them, like strife, are essential to life. Just suppose every evil were removed. Boredom would be as intolerable as pain. The more successful we become, the more we are bored. We are unhappy married and unmarried unhappy. We are unhappy alone and unhappy in society. I have this problem all the time. The higher the organism, the greater the suffering. Pain reaches its highest degree in man. Life is evil because life is war. Every species fights for the matter, space, and time of the others. If we were to conduct the confirmed optimist through hospitals, prisons, over battlefields, and places of execution, he too would understand the nature of this world.
Yes. Is it doing it?
At the end, we need death. Just as experience begins to coordinate itself into wisdom, brain and body begin to decay. What is a partial solution, given there is no complete solution? Knowledge, though born of the will, may overwhelm the will. The more we know of our passions, the less they control us. So experience and thought purify the will. What one human being can mean to another is not a great deal. In the end, we stand alone. The happiness that we receive from ourselves is greater than that from our surroundings. The world in which a man lives shapes itself chiefly by the way in which he looks at it. The Hindus say that the I is a delusion and that the only reality is the infinite one. That art thou. Our central virtue should be compassion. Compassion is the only thing of moral value, breaking through the barrier of the self and knowing that individuality is an illusion is the way to escaping the will. Only by the transformation of consciousness can we stop the willing. Now that means extinction of our very essence, and this is obtainable by very few saints or people in an extremity of suffering.
Thank you. Thank you. My thought at the end, I think, of course, he doesn't take into account human wonder at the world, and I think he doesn't. I don't know why he doesn't mention it, because he must indeed have a great wonder at the world to have gone so deeply into philosophy, into how things, according to him, work, and into the physics, the dynamics of the world. But I think in his life, he didn't suffer. I think he probably was subjected to that boredom often, but still his mind was so active and so large. He is a conundrum. I feel that he never loved anybody, but once he came to the age of around 68 and his work was recognized, he, for the brief years he had left, was a happy man, and he used to keep note of what people were saying. He's a complex and wonderful man, and he is also outraged by suffering. You don't have to experience it to experience, obviously, the outrage of it, which he did witness during the wars. We can open it up now to what people have to say.
When did Schopenhauer die?
Hmm?
When did Schopenhauer die?
He died 1870s, 60,
Okay.
70, 60 probably.
Okay, so he was alive during the time Maxwell's life. So he would have known.
No, then it may have been later because he didn't know. He didn't know about the physics of that time. He was just in a little village.
Yeah, that's all.
In a
Okay, I'm
hotel.
just saying he was alive at the time, so
Yeah.
still.
Yeah,
Okay.
and people have said that about his Buddhism.
Yeah.
That it was in his lifetime, but again, he wasn't exposed to it. He was reclusive.
Well, not outwardly anyway.
Do you know how he, whether, I'm sorry, my
Go ahead.
Yes, Peter.
We can hear.
do you know if he knew of and reacted to the early discussions of evolution by natural selection?
Yeah, he would have. Yes, he did know. That came out in 1858, I
Yeah.
think. So he did know. In fact, he incorporated some of that into his philosophy. Just the idea of reproduction and the weeding out of inferior organisms. Again, it's the will. Evolution is the will in action. But
He's quite a long time before Herbert Spencer, but you can see the possibility of it going towards that. I guess.
yes, yeah.
Peter, do you want to clarify a little more about Spencer, just for the rest of us?
I think Spencer is late 19th century, so maybe 30 years after Darwin. He takes evolution by natural selection as a social political philosophy justifying survival of the fittest, essentially, which obviously can be taken to extreme positions supporting ruthless capitalism and some Nazi ideas too.
He did not know of Spencer, but he did know of Darwin. But that was a different thing. But I know he didn't know about the acrimony and the attacks on Darwin and the social Darwinism. That was not in his work anyway.
There are so many attractors that it's difficult to choose only one or two, or to come to a overview statement on my part as to sort of how this grabs me. I read Schopenhauer. What about music? You didn't mention music.
I do. I can go into that. I wanted people to talk.
Okay, so you're going to
Yeah.
bring in music, because
Yeah.
that was very important to me in my first jaunts with Schopenhauer. But obviously, the central rubric here, if rubric's not exactly the right term, is the will.
Yeah, that's it.
The will, and it's just sort of thinking out loud at the moment, as the substrate of human consciousness.
Yeah.
So once again, at least it occurs to me, the quest of all Western philosophy in the Western way to establish ground, a ground of being, somewhere to stand or to place one's mind so that there is a framework for thinking, and the whole of philosophy from the Greeks, the earliest question, what is reality? And then that's taken down the material track, which is, well, let's look for earth, air, fire, water. And ultimately, we will see that everything is based on earth or air or fire or water or electrons or muons or bosons. We will have the ground, we'll have the ultimate thing in itself, as you say.
Mhm.
But then the other track in the Western tradition, I'm going too far, is again the spiritual or the ideal or the idea. And thus his book, The World as Will and Idea, right?
In representation.
Pardon?
In representation.
The word
Real
Representation.
representation.
Yeah.
real over representation.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when you say when you give the examples of particles for the thing in itself, I think it goes beyond, and that the thing in itself is actually outside of that. When he defines another way to take the will, in other words, would be to say that this is what the representation is not.
Yes.
And the representation for Schopenhauer is anything that can be treated as a subject-object, or in a subject-object relationship.
Yeah.
So not only what is material, but also everything that can be
Right.
conceptualized
Right.
is the representation.
Right. The knower and the known. If you have a knower and the known, then you have the world that we live in,
Yes.
not the world as it is.
And the leap of faith from his perspective is that, weirdly enough, the will is accessible by everybody in a phenomenological way. Like, it's like the thing that basically is before, it's at the inception of thoughts that to touch on the will or the thing in itself. It's almost like a phenomenological approach.
Well, I guess I don't agree with it being a phenomenological approach. It's metaphysical. We can't know it. We can only have an idea of it by deep introspection.
Mm-hmm.
But when he uses the word will, he's also using it in a way that it's inexplicable to him. It's just that he is accessing it the way we would, but he's saying that because of the way we are made, we can only get a hint.
Mhm.
And he was very much influenced by Kant, who he thought was a great philosopher. He didn't have much respect for any others. And Kant said that we are stuck in a world of space and time and causality. And he laboriously showed how that was the case. And he left it in the sense that we can't know anything beyond that. Therefore, we can't know. And he left it at we can't know. And Schopenhauer took up the gauntlet and said, well, we can know something. And so when he writes as if he knows the will intimately, but then other times he says he just knows what is driving him and the people. He stepped off the will by getting into his 2-room house and with a dog, and I think that says a lot for I don't know what it says. It says that the character and the philosophy jive, and they don't normally jive.
Well, to take that up, I'm kind of curious what you think now, or what anybody in the audience here thinks about the relationship between what seems to be his suffering, or one could even go so far as to say his psychopathology, and the nature and shape, the contours of his philosophy. It's not jiving for me, which is why I'm curious about it.
It seems like wasn't one of those sayings actually sort of addressing that the way you, it seemed like it was one of the ones on your paper. Maybe it wasn't.
Yeah, it depends on the thing.
I don't know. No, I don't want to find it now. The world in which man lives shapes itself chiefly by the way in which he looks at it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why if you can manage a Buddhistic or a objective point of view, he gives two possible solutions, well, aids to mitigate the effect of the will, and music and other arts are the main thing for him. Is that's a time when you contemplate beauty, and it's disinterested contemplation. You're not trying to get anything out of it. You are just there looking basically at the mirror of the world. And for some great artists, there is a mirroring of our world that hits us in a sense of truth. And those aesthetes can step off the will by their aesthetic proclivities. The other way is by, in a sense, training your mind, and in the way that the Buddhists do, that life is suffering, and acknowledging it and living with it. And I think what I've heard about him personally, he didn't suffer in his life. He was not. He was. He had a very bad relationship with his mother, and they split up, and then he didn't seem to have close friendships. But
Sounds a little like suffering.
no, well, you see, the funny thing is, I've read a lot about him, and they emphasize that he enjoyed his life. So, and I haven't read so much about him. I've mostly read his work. But yeah, maybe he did suffer. I know that he suffered from sexual desires that he repudiated, and because he didn't like women, and he didn't like being subjected to sexual desire. So is that suffering? I don't know. That's getting away from the will, right?
Well, one thing, just whether we want to go to this direction or not, but I do see directly, the Freudian lensing of this, and that is for the will. I think we could say Freud is going to speak of the id and desire, obviously, and then the statements that well, and Oscar Wilde had this summed up very succinctly, and he said the only thing worse than not getting what you want is getting it.
Yeah.
That's right. Boredom.
So
Boredom.
he must have read Schopenhauer. But, certainly he's approaching energy here in a way that's going to come out both in Freud, but also in Jung. Jung is going to emphasize energy as a metaphor of what we experience. We experience energetic transactions and so forth. So he's into that. I can see, yes, from Darwin to Marx, serving the will, and it's actually the will and the basic human instincts that are driving everything, the sexual, the basic instinctual needs for survival. Is that all there is? Well, there's a lot there we could dig into, but I'm also struck with your statement of purifying the will. Now that sounds like a thoroughly metaphysical project.
When did I say that?
You quoting him or
Oh.
something.
Uh-huh.
The process of purifying the will or escaping the will.
Right.
Now Freud is not. Well, we don't need to bring Freud in at this point, but using transforming consciousness.
Yes. Yeah.
So he, and also in the face of love and death, which seemed to him to have been pointless.
Yeah, love is pointless to him, at least sexual love, love of the opposite sex is not available to him because he dislikes women.
So we would probably tend to put him into analysis and say that
We need to work on the mother issue.
he has a very shallow complex.
No, I suspect there would not be a whole lot of difference among the men of his time in Europe, that women were inferior beings. It was still the time of the wandering womb, and hysteria comes later. I mean, women were not thought of, it was a matter of course that women were inferior.
This was before any appointments could be made with Dr. Freud.
Yes.
Dr. Jung, they were simply not available for consultation.
Well, Dr. Freud, were he born at that time, would be in great concurrence with the majority of males that women were good. Schopenhauer says that women are only good for reproduction. I don't. You read enough of that as a woman, and particularly if you read a lot of the stuff from the past, you just let that slide because it's just part of what was at the time. And
Didn't know when I got
and I forgive him. No, I forgive him that. And it's not as if he's misanthropic in general, but I think, yeah, we do need to think about the man, but he covered his tracks and mostly just left his philosophy and some of his activities, like we can make much out of him being alone in a village and the gold coin, but I don't think all that, and people have said, oh, he seemed to enjoy his life, but I think the philosophy is the deep thing, the deep pain, and I think if you take a guy who's starting to write about it at age 20 and still working on it at age 70, this is something that is more than a psychoanalytic blip. It's something, this is life work and life thought.
There's something in, I should say, I just very recently read an essay of his. I haven't read very much of Schopenhauer, but there's an essay on the apparent deliberateness on the apparent deliberateness in the fate of the individual, which I got interested in because Jung apparently influenced his idea of synchronicity. And there's a dichotomy here, I guess I'm wondering about, and how you think about it, between tentativeness, knowing you don't know, which apparently there is there, that you really don't know what will is, versus that kind of identification and certainty that you are right there with the thrust of will. Which, you can see it's kind of an inflation, I guess, in individuals who have that. I mean, you can see it happening, some see it maybe in Jung, but balanced maybe by a tentativeness too. And I mean, if you're seeing it act out, then you think you're fated. Fate is operating through you. If you stay tentative, then maybe there's fate, and you're just not quite sure. But you want to put that forward, as people do think that way. You attempted to think that. I guess I wonder how you see that in him.
I suppose what Gregory, you were saying, that the will for people, in the world, even though it's a metaphysical thing, as he calls it, it's still a phenomenological thing for you and me, and we can recognize it in ourselves. And so the inflation takes part when he says, well, this is how the world is, and not just your world, but the universe. And of course, he can't say that. There's, what may be true in one part of the world, a little speck on a speck, may not be true on multiple worlds. But again, that's a big inflation that he's using when he says, I'm going to generalize from this world to all worlds and to the entire cosmos. He calls it a cosmic principle. So there lies the flaw. Yeah.
Well, he calls it a cosmic principle it's by opposition to the principle of fragmentation that is pointing at the fact that we experience the world in a fragmented way, and the opposite way of that would be that if we wouldn't be dissociated, we would be the real. It's not that we wouldn't have access, it's that we don't have access to this now. We can have a glimpse of that, and the only way to have a glimpse of that is through our body or embodied situation. But by opposition, the will is this cosmic force, or even, I don't know your take about that, maybe there is a hint here at pantheism, and not pantheism in the sense that God is pervasive and everywhere in the universe, but that everything is, and it's just that we are dissociated from it, which makes us isolated and unable to other than through these glimpses, incapable of reconnecting with the will, and thus making us having this perpetual hallucination, seeing the world as a representation.
Yeah, I think when he brings up compassion, I think that is where, and the unity of humanity, that's where his philosophy has much worth, and going along with Eastern philosophy, that we are all one and we all suffer. And that's a metaphysical statement of his, but it's also a phenomenological statement. So it's both. Phenomenon meaning the appearance of things.
Well, I was struck that the language of dissociation and inflation and complexes, none of that language was available. That framing, that whole framework from Freud through Jung was not available to look at Schopenhauer and say, well, is there any inflation in your work, Professor? Just that particular analytic term used psychologically was not available. But I'm struck too with how from Schopenhauer we can pretty well see direct paths to Kierkegaard and to Nietzsche.
Right.
Taking and it's all there in Schopenhauer, but then they're taking these branches further. Kierkegaard is arriving at a leap of faith in a very Christian way, and Nietzsche is saying no faith. It really, indeed, it is all will, which unfortunately can be associated with ongoing development of European experience as the triumph of the will, as it was expressed in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, where the will is everything. So that there's no God, particularly, other than the God who is manifest in all of these modes of sheer willpower. Unfortunately, that has come back in the United States of America in our time, a view that only power is real, and only those who wage power are actually performing real acts in the world. But Schopenhauer goes instead of to a Christian transcendence, shall we say, by faith, which Kierkegaard labors with. Schopenhauer turns to Buddhism, and again to music, but then he also to Wittgenstein's carrying on the other pathway, which is how are we using this language? We have a problem with any of the language we're using, and we're trapped by our language. But Wittgenstein had not made that point for Schopenhauer, so he didn't have the benefit of that criticism yet either.
Do you think, John, I mean, you said the will is somewhat similar with power, and you use the expression
Will to
will
power,
to
yeah.
power.
Triumph to will.
And taking as an example what was valued in the 30s in Europe and what you say is valued again today. But couldn't we say that the will point at something maybe a little more subtle, like something like consciousness, and that by will we could understand that if will is pervasive, this is like a manifestation of consciousness. Well, I shouldn't use the word manifestation. That there is some sort of consciousness in everything, and that this is what he wants, that he's trying to describe as power or willing, something that basically that we are dissociated from, and that we have at the same time. I don't know. I'm trying to draw a parallel between the will and consciousness, and wondering if it's more accurate than between will and power.
I think will, he has it both ways, but the will for Nietzsche is more in this world, right? It's not metaphysical. He brings it down to the race, the race of the blonde beasts, and he takes I believe he takes Schopenhauer to a more worldly level than Schopenhauer is thinking. Schopenhauer talks about the energy in everything. So that's the form that the will takes in matter. So it's dynamic. It's always increasing and trying.
It seems to me like a repackaging of Aristotle's unmoved mover. Do you think that's like in the background of Schopenhauer? You know, like he doesn't realize he's just sort of restating the notion of the unmoved mover?
I don't know. Tell us more how you would parallel them.
Just that the unmoved mover is the force that moves things.
Mm-hmm.
That has that you know, we can put characteristics to it in terms of desire or in terms of, you know, just the life force.
It'd just be push.
Dynamism.
Yeah. But is outside, is not the movement itself.
Right. Yeah. Well, I listened to a couple of philosophers about this, and they were opining that Schopenhauer would have been better off had he not used will, had he used energy, and you could say that, but then what you do is lose, I think, the power of his thought, because when he brings it down, when he brings a big thing down to earth, and talks about, you know, the spiteful human beings, you know, they're not grand, they're not wonderful, they're not like Kantian human beings. These are grungy people who are doing their best to make their way in a rotten world. And so he's got these extremes that I think is very, very wonderful, because no philosopher I know of has that, you know, the metaphysics, and then this guy trying to make it through the world. It's just great. And he was thoroughly familiar with all the, you know, the philosophers.
The ancients. Yeah.
He didn't like any of them except Kant and Plato, of course.
So what I find interesting, you know, is what we're talking about is in what I read is that the Hindus say that the I is a delusion, and the only reality is the one. So, and then below he says, only by the transformation of consciousness can we stop the willing. That means extinction of our very essence.
Yeah. So,
you know, he's alluding to an outside, the one, the whatever you want to call the all, as being the controlling force. That what we're seeing is an illusion. What
yes, we are an illusion. We live in a world of illusion, and we live in the world of space and time, but Kant got rid of space and time and causality. So we live in a world that doesn't exist. It's only in our mind. But the real world is a world of oneness. And the Buddhists try to with their stepping back from life, try to be one with the oneness, and the Hindus, but to know that we are all one, but the world, whatever it is a unity, because laboriously Kant went through it, but if you have if you don't have space and time, you can't have one thing in the same space at the same time. If they're in the same space at the same time, they're the same thing. So if everything's the same, then everything is one. And so that's how he derived the unity, how Kant derived the unity. And then Schopenhauer derived his unity from the will being the one thing. And then when you step off the will, what happens to you? I don't know. Maybe you're in that different plane. The world is in itself.
Can you step off the one thing?
Well, it means that what he said right here is that this means extinction of our very essence.
Yes.
So we throw off all the veils.
Yes.
That's right. Altogether,
right.
And we have to die to ourselves because we're something other than that.
Yes.
I think at the end of those Francis prayer is like dying one awakens to eternal life. And some people are like, well, no, because I don't believe in that. It's like it's very much philosophical to die to the self, to realize there is no separation. There's just the space and time illusion. Because I couldn't handle feeling, knowing, being all at the same time. I can only fragment it to this type of existence right here, but I'm sure that at some point I, you, and all of us are that same one through all time, all possibilities. I've experienced it very briefly, but it's not something that can be held on to,
What intrigues me is that the Eastern, particularly Buddhism, is woven all through this. And I don't know how far he pursued that. And with Buddhist meditation, you try to examine your own mind. You shut everything else down and let the mind run. And what is it that I really am or think myself? Now, I don't know what he might have done to dig down very deep and say, can I get down to whatever the will is with that? But it is an intriguing thought. And he came to Buddhism a little bit late, but you can see it, even the language of it, woven all through his writing.
Yeah,
it's a change of perspectivity. I think we could say, as it's possible to learn more about Buddhism, and as this world life is changing, so that this contact between Christianity and Christendom with non-Christian religions. I mean, for us, it's a liberal virtue, although you have to think about all the others. Well, there was no thinking about all the others through medieval Christianity, with one exception I want to bring up, because there are a couple of interesting parallels, and that is Islam. In Islam, it is the will of God that brings everything into existence. So nothing exists apart from the will of God. We could take that up. But interestingly, just to make one circuit of connection, Lisa, with what you were saying, Islamic metaphysics is Aristotelian. And so this notion of dynamism, and again, the energy, in Aristotle, very much, I mean, Aristotle really brings forward the very notion of dynamism, that let's look at how everything is changing, but we can analyze that. And then, as you say, for Aristotle, we still have an unmoved mover. We have the God. Schopenhauer has dispensed with that need.
No, he did talk about religion. He didn't like religion, but insofar as he could like religion, he liked the Christian religion. He abhorred Islam. He also, of course, the Hinduism. Christianity, and he didn't like Judaism, it was too cheerful. But what he liked about Christianity, that he was glad that Christianity took into it the Jewish Bible where it talks about original sin. And he thought that Christianity was a very pessimistic religion, and rightfully so, because it devalued this world in favor of a better one. So in that, he thought that Christianity was he called it a melancholy religion, pessimistic religion, and it expressed the true nature of things, whereas Judaism did not. And he felt that there was, again, that relationship with Hinduism, that life is travail and you get out of it when you can.
Yes, I find myself wondering what might have happened if he'd used energy more than will, or differently, or instead of will. Because there's something that happened to the concept of energy after him in the late 19th century, and that's the conservation of energy. I mean, conservation laws. Mm-hmm. And you can see that, actually you can see it in Freud, certainly in Jung, the idea that there's a transformation of whatever this psychic energy is from one form to another. Say sublimation can be seen that way in Freud. And in Jung, all the different transformations of energy in the psyche. And thinking how these terms evolve, I don't know, I mean, will sounds like the way we're discussing it more unitary and not split into multiple forms, maybe hard to think of it in personal complexes quite as much. I don't know, maybe that isn't right.
Yes.
I'm struck with the language issue, which I think we're on that one. I think you raise it, Peter, but I'm just going to play a hunch here. But does it matter if we frame this urgrund, this basic ground of reality in the will, and let's put that signifier. We'll put that signifier in brackets, the will, and let it hang there. Or, as you say, the alternative, to put in brackets, energy, to put in there. Well, to begin with, the will, I believe, is probably a Germanic word. I'd have to look up the etymology here, which I will do. Whereas energy is a Greek word. Mm-hmm. There is a feeling tone difference. Wittgenstein would at least want to note that in passing. Well, this language is not functioning exactly the same way with these terms. I'm going to look up.
Well, to add to that, Shakespeare in Sonnet 236, I believe. Some things get etched into your mind, and this one got etched into my mind at a Renaissance fair in Kenosha, Wisconsin, while I was in high school, because there was some guy dressed up as Shakespeare and reciting his poems, and he recited this poem about the will. that punned on Shakespeare's first name, the will as, this kind of concept, and the fact that the will was let's say a term for the sexual organs. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
Dylan Thomas made good use of it.
yeah, so did well, anyhow, where was I going with this?
Where's the will leading you?
Oh, I think it was your riff about, etymology and where this comes from, and indeed looking at the family resemblances, as Wittgenstein would say, between all of these meanings embodied in this term will.
It is, I'm sorry, I can interject.
Yeah,
it is a Germanic origin. And there's a whole story here. But it is a Germanic origin, and energy, again, as you said, is Greek. Again, this term will, I can almost say, one of the most profound that I know in existence is Leni Riefenstahl's film, The Triumph of the Villain, the Triumph of the Will, which was a Nazi production and met all the requirements that the party set out for it. And the film was presented as the triumph of the will. This is not new territory here.
Well, the reason why there was no Greek term for the will was because they didn't deal with the will. It wasn't in their purview. The will didn't come into being in the world until the Christians brought it. And it was, if you had a bad will, you were going to go to hell. But the will was a very important part of Christianity, and that's when it all came about. It's interesting that the will has a history. The other thing that I was thinking too about parallels to the will, in Homer's work, the will descended from the gods, so the human beings would be doing what they were doing, and then the gods would make them do something entirely different. And there was a passage in the Iliad where Agamemnon apologizes to his Achilles, who's sulking, and he says, I didn't mean to do this. I didn't mean to take your woman. It was the Atate, Zeus's daughter, who made me do it. Mm-hmm. And Achilles accepted this apology because they were used to things coming from a supernatural cause and making them do what they didn't want to. And that was the equivalent, even though it had essential difference, but it was the equivalent of the will. But the gods used it, not the humans.
It strikes me as what you said, I think, towards the beginning about being emotional first and rational very much afterwards.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and that sounds like a complex.
Yeah, but isn't that something that Jung believes? I'm sure he believes.
Yeah. No, that's the heart of the notion of a complex, is that it seems to be coming from outside yourself, something making you.
Oh,
it sure does.
Yeah. And it goes back to archetypes and hence the gods and
Yeah, God through the archetypes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's fascinating about the different meanings of will and the confusing meaning that as to whether you do it or not, or whether it's done to you.
Yes.
Mhm.
Whether, I mean, there's the beautiful, I keep thinking of the beautiful Dylan Thomas line, the force that through the green fuse drives the flower. We don't have any say. But we tend to use the word will in a way of, I mean, an equivalent in modern terms, I guess I've read it in politics recently, backbone, right? If you have backbone, then you're asserting will. And that seems totally opposite to what Schopenhauer said.
That's a good point, Peter. There does seem to be a lack of will to stand up to
Other wills.
other wills. Yeah. Yeah.
But well, yes and no, and this and more. I mean, we are in a world that is very much at war at the moment. But then, of course, Schopenhauer is saying that we're always at war. The will is always driving us into warfare, inner warfare or outer warfare.
And to what extent is that simply the dance of the opposites, which is what a lot of the Eastern philosophies think is that creative driving force in the universe?
Yes.
Lots would say that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's life, death, life, death, life, death. And
But it's the suffering that he objects to.
he objects to half of it, yes.
Yeah, he's not saying it's okay. And
Yeah.
he, throughout the book, it's 2 volumes,
Yeah.
he gives these gruesome details of what we do and what insects do, what other animals do to each other. One of them, this archaic creature gives birth to another creature, and that creature that's just being given birth is not yet separated from the first creature, and it turns around and starts eating the one that gave birth to it. So he's very taken with the suffering in the world. I think that's really drives the whole idea of will, as opposed to the more sterile word energy, because he doesn't like the will, and you can't take a position of liking or not liking energy. You know, it's just there. You know, you don't have an argument with energy, but you do have an argument with will,
With suffering.
But
The first thing the Buddhists say is there is suffering.
yes,
Get it, accept it.
yeah.
I mean, that's kind of their main thing, is actually accepting that there is suffering.
Well, he's not a good
And no, he
Buddhist.
hasn't accepted it, he's declaring it evil all over the place.
Well, yeah, we have God concept problems here that Jung is going to ultimately emphasize that a world problem is the God problem, and that is no God or this God or a gazillion gods, galaxies of gods, Disneylands of gods, or no God, zero God, Zippo God. But Jung's saying that we have an instinctual archetypal drive with this issue.
Yeah,
And
we want to
Schopenhauer-
personify things,
And that
don't
is, pardon?
we? We want to personify, don't we?
I was going to say, it just struck me as you were talking that Schopenhauer in some ways is in Job's position, saying, how did you create this horrible universe? What a big mess.
Yes.
Did he also say at the beginning that it's man's desire that is separate from the will, or bigger than the will, is what that creates the suffering? Is that what
Is
you
that
said?
where's the breach?
I think it's part of the will.
Yeah, part of the one. Yeah.
Say that again.
I thought you said that he said when man's desire is greater than the will, that's when it causes suffering.
No, I was talking about the Greeks. That was their way of trying to explain what was happening to them because they didn't have the concept of the will. But for Schopenhauer, the will does double duty as being, the force that we can't get away from. And even if you're a Buddhist, it's still there.
Yeah.
And it would still be your desire that's bigger than the will that would trust suffering. That's so Buddhist for him to say, for that to, that's why I thought you said he said. So anyways, I didn't quite catch it all into this coming there.
If we couldn't make a rapprochement with the jihad.
What?
The jihad.
The jihad?
Yes, with the will as a this concept of personal this component of the person that is fighting the representations. It's in a way there is it's making a conceptual leap, but trying to bring that back to what is the mover in the individuation process. Mm-hmm. And if you quiz Freud, that's the libido, and here there is like amongst Jungians this idea that there is something that is driving people toward the self and out away from their conditions, and their conditions being basically hindered or intertwined with the idea of complexes, of things that are basically creating this prison that we are in. And that's why I'm thinking about the jihad, the Islamic jihad, of this idea of doing this, having this personal war, inside war at play toward.
That reminds me of something. I was listening to that Donald Kalshed YouTube on This Jungian Life, and one of the things he said had to do with with authoritarianism. Suffering leads to violence, whereas in democracy, violence results in suffering.
Yes, that's the syllogism. You may need to say that again, however, because it's kind of complex.
Right. So I mean, suffering in Kalshed's world comes from basically early childhood trauma, and when the child is not, I think, valued for its own selfhood, its own beingness, it suffers, and that suffering in a certain environment can lead to violence, and that it's that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. It's that personal experience that then becomes collective experience. Mm-hmm. And then the opposite of that,
authoritarian violence.
Yeah, authoritarian violence. So jihad, that's the connection there. Whereas when you've got an inner democracy going, when you're listening to all of the opposing voices in your head, and you can handle loving and hating your mother at the same time, and and hold that tension of opposites, then the violence that was done becomes suffering, and you can mourn it, and you can
compassion.
Yeah, and that leads to compassion. Yeah.
Yeah, you haven't brought up so many parallels with Jung that I thought you would. I don't know if there are that many. They're both pessimistic, of course, and I think of course, Jung is more accepting of the foibles, right? Even though he expresses distaste for a lot of what we are, he accepts it in the name of wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's built in, and you can't get rid of a lot of the
undesirable parts.
Yeah.
You have to acknowledge them for actually the gifts that they are to your whole being.
The shadow.
The shadow, yeah.
Through the individuation process, because that's
Yeah.
part of it.
Yeah.
You can't avoid that.
Right.
I think one of the biggest differences in this moment in our conversation with Jung and this the perspectives we've been discussing with Schopenhauer, but also with Freud, and also with Darwin, and also with Marx, who dedicated Das Kapital to Darwin after all. But that is our human nature, if we'll hold that term for a moment, purely, shall we say, from the bottom up, purely biological, purely from the entire evolutionary history of humankind, and everything is welling up, this force or this energy is welling up from within this emergent evolutionary process, in which case it could be, and for what good is it, or why does he say, well, this is not worth it, it's not worth doing this, it's not working. But I think for Jung, however, and this is a major difference, that the energy is not only from below, to use that metaphor, nor is the energy or the force only from the past. But here we're even going to have to bring in Brother Gebser at some point, and Aurobindo and Teilhard de Chardin. But that is to say, there is an attractor that is calling humankind and all of reality forward from the future.
Well, and Aristotle, we can't forget the four causes.
Final cause, right?
Yeah.
This is in Jung. Jung has a teleology. It takes a while to go through this, because if you just take it in a superficial way, which is what folks who are ready and willing and eager to be superficial are going to be superficial. Jung's teleology takes a little work, but it is fundamental to the individuation. And that is that any of us can say we are engaged in it. If we use this language and framing, and this is the practice, we are engaged in a process of individuating, which is actually not only leading from where we have come from, however much work there is to do there with shadow and so forth, but there is also a destination, which is the self. And Jung says that's the best term I've got to work with as a psychologist. And he said, I've taken it from Hinduism, the notion of the great self, which people are also arguing endlessly. Great self, small self, big self. But Jung, the point is, there is an attractor in each of our lives and in all of our lives. And I'll stop here, but just speaking of the force, Jung also says if we are not conscious of this, and that'll invite us to talk about what consciousness is, then we live our lives as being shaped by fate. In which case, you could look at Schopenhauer, perhaps, if you want to do a Jungian analysis. We never do, say, how did Schopenhauer come up with his own personal felt sense of his fate? I mean, that's a reasonable proposition.
Well, it is, because on the face of it, the superficial, it seemed like he did step off the wheel of striving. He had the money. He did not allow himself to be taken over by this force that he thought was full of suffering. So it is, we're talking about his psychology again, and yes, he would have had an agenda and a human project beckoning from the future, and as I guess we all do.
No, it's all here. It's all fecund in this discussion. Elena has something to say. Elena, speak up.
Yeah, I have a question. Do you really think that suffering is guiding to violence?
What? Violence?
Do you really believe that all suffering is guiding to violence?
No, not all suffering, but in some people, that is the trajectory, that they take their suffering, and instead of what's the word? Integrating it and learning from it, and
They don't know what to do with it.
yeah, and so they project their suffering outward, and this is von Franz coming in here again, projecting it onto others that either they think are doing violence to them, or that they think are causing that suffering, and they then have to do violence.
Representation would be a good term.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking it's a mix of a culture and maybe allowness to attack others. But there are also many women who were suffering but not necessarily familiar with physical violence and would never attack. I feel like physical violence is something masculine, and it's from
attack themselves a lot.
Yeah, but there are so many women who suffered, but they never attack anyone.
Yeah,
and they are not going violent.
Passive aggressive.
I'm not sure if suffering guides always to violence, because maybe what we know, maybe men, but women. How many women are going on rampage and beating up others? I don't know, not many.
I think it's a personal personal and psychocultural response. The culture often says, women are supposed to be meek and quiet and not express their anger and rage, and so instead they either turn it inward or they turn it on their kids. They don't go out in the world
consciously or not.
Right, consciously or not, they'll
It does get passed on.
it does, yeah.
Well, I'm not familiar with that, but I think it has a lot to do with culture and allowance for violence to exist, because sometimes kids get even weapons as a present in some cultures by birth.
You've been watching the news lately, haven't you? Okay, so we have a
maybe the men are more like suffered through violence as young guys, in women don't. It's the same, follow the same pattern as they go up. It's more verbal, more affecting who they are as a person, and with men is more aggressive, and maybe that's the difference.
Yeah,
It's two different
Yeah.
ways,
yeah,
the way we grow
Yeah,
up.
it's not so much
Mhm.
literal violence with women, but it's still violence,
Yeah,
yeah,
and it still damages everybody.
yeah, then
Yeah.
it's the same, but it's in a different way.
right, yeah, yeah.
Yes, your statement, Lisa, with the Kalshid lecture, and anybody's curious about that, I can get you a link to a very good interview with the analyst Donald Kalshid, who's an authority on trauma, and particularly concerns there with developmental psychology, and that is early trauma. And for Kalshid, his focus, and he's used to be your neighbor there in New Mexico, Mike, but he moved, and now is Misha's neighbor up in New England, or in Maine. But at any rate, Kalshid's work is with developmental psychology and early trauma. So his comment was specifically on early trauma, young kids. And then, we could do an entire evening, to say the least, on discussing the developmental psychology and trauma and, Kalshid's work, and so forth. We can do that if we need to. But in this evening's conversation, I'm feeling very much a closeness to this sense of energy and will and the dynamism as presentiated by Schopenhauer. It's all there. I see Freud, I just say, okay, Freud took that, and yes, of course, Jung, very much so. And well, as Jung's statement, the quote you put in the thing was that Jung said that when he first read Schopenhauer, he was the first philosopher that Jung said he really related to because he was serious about suffering.
Yes, that's right.
Whereas apparently in Jung's world, as can be so much, I don't know how is it in contemporary society, suffering is not appropriate for polite conversation. In social settings, you don't talk about politics, you don't talk about religion, you certainly don't talk about your suffering, and you never would talk about your childhood injuries or abuse patterns. And at this point, again, we have to talk very carefully, because almost the number of people, and including those of us sitting at the table, to say, early traumatic injury is a very serious matter, and it's not resolved by any quick summary statements or the use of any number of linguistic signifiers. Anyone gets that into it. So
are you saying the talking cure doesn't work?
It's interesting, my children today think that trauma is just this new buzzword that everybody's using, but it's apparently early childhood trauma has been, an issue of discussion with philosophers for a long time. And still no one has figured out what to do about it and to stop people to those patterns and to heal those things. I mean, I think we're getting to
Just start looking at it.
Philosophers had not considered it because the whole Western philosophical tradition has paid no attention to developmental psychology or developmental issues. The child is always just sort of an unformed, crude version of the adult.
So here's an interesting, real case from the history of medicine, and it has to do. It was brought to my attention in a book about sense making, because it illustrates how if we don't know how to make sense of particular data in front of us, we don't see the pattern yet, it just over the head. So back in the 50s, some doctors were starting to see, these kids would be brought in for some particular illness, and they do an X-ray, And the doctors would notice, like what seemed to be a healed broken bone. And it would be like, what's going on here? Is the child's bone density too low? No, it's fine. So they asked the parents, did the child, break their arm, or have any, falls or accidents? And the parents would go, oh, no. And so the doctors were just left, sort of like, And the reason that they did not see what was going on with these children is because at that time, the doctors were like really embedded with the community. Like they went to church with these people. They birthed all of their kids. They saw them on the street and in the store, and they were all nice, good people. And they could not believe that these parents were battering their children. And it wasn't until more studies were done and the pattern became a little more apparent that somebody figured it out, because I forget the exact instance where it was like this person knew that there was some instability in the family, and kind of put two and two together that, they're beating their kid. And so that's how we got battered child syndrome. But if the ability to believe something about your fellow human beings is not there, like you won't.
Or, and the converse, if the consistent projection is that this is the case with the other, then one will see.
Yeah.
It's projected.
Yeah.
It's not just applies to that, it applies to almost any field. Where
Right, yeah, it does.
We have blinders on it and we say,
Mhm.
we don't see. It's just because.
Yeah, you could regale us with stories of physics. Like,
Yes, I could. My own work, actually.
But just to finish up with Schopenhauer, he changed philosophy after his book, because nobody really tackled the metaphysics except Nietzsche, but Nietzsche was in both camps, and more in the camp of the here and now, this place, as opposed to a metaphysical concept of power. So, and he also brought it away from this extreme, dense, obscure prose, ways of putting things that like Hegel was practically unreadable, and that his example, his beautiful prose, his humor, his sarcasm, and his clarity changed everything with philosophy after that. And so people took on smaller things, and philosophers took on smaller aspects of the world, and were more clear about it. So that was a major advance in philosophy from Schopenhauer. The last great metaphysician, probably.
Right. Why would you say the last great, not like the first?
Oh, there were other metaphysicians like Leibniz. There were a lot of people who were trying to figure out what the world is, and with their own theories here. But after Schopenhauer, it wasn't that way.
all right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Eileen.
This is a good start.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Start.
Yes.